Hello everyone, welcome to opsbyyash. Today I will be covering Docker versus virtual machine. What if I told you that running an application inside a virtual machine is a little like moving into an entire apartment just to use the bathroom? It works, but it might be slightly overkill. And that's basically the difference between virtual machine and Docker containers. Both gives you application isolation, but the way they achieve it is completely different. So let's break it down. Virtual machine means give my application an entire computer, and Docker container means give my application an isolated environment. First, let's understand what is a virtual machine and how it works. A virtual machine allow you to run an entire computer inside another computer. For example, your physical server might be running Linux using a hypervisor like VMware, Hyper-V or KVM. You can create multiple virtual machines. Each VM gets virtual CPU, RAM, storage, networking, and most importantly, its own operating system. So your server could have VM1 Ubuntu, VM2 Windows, and VM3 another Linux distribution. Each VM behaves almost like an independent computer. That's incredibly useful. But there is a downside. Every VM has to carry its own operating system, and operating system aren't exactly lightweighted passengers. Now understand what Docker container is and how it works. Docker asks a different question. Instead of saying let's create another entire computer, Docker says I just need an isolated environment to run my application. That's where containers comes in. A container packages your application together with the things it needs to run, like libraries, dependencies, configurations that your application require, and the application itself. But unlike a VM, a container doesn't need a complete guest operating system. Containers share the host operating system's kernel while maintaining isolation between applications. And that's the big idea behind it. Let's visualize the difference. With virtual machine, the stack looks something like this. Each virtual machine carries its own operating system. There would be a boot start time, high resources will be needed, and there is a strong hardware OS boundary. Now look at Docker. The containers share the host kernel, so you are not booting a complete operating system for every application. You are creating isolated environment on the top of existing operating system. And that's one reason containers can be significantly more lightweighted. And this difference becomes really obvious when you start them. A VM needs to boot an operating system. The kernel starts, system services start, networking comes up, and eventually your application starts. And in a container, the host operating system is already running. Docker creates the container environment, start the application, and you are ready to go. That's why containers can start much faster and typically consume fewer resources than equivalent full VMs, which means on the same infrastructure, you can often run many more containers than VMs. More applications, less overhead. But wait, does this mean virtual machines are obsolete? Absolutely not. VMs are still extremely important. They can provide a strong isolation and allow you to run completely different operating systems on the same physical hardware. Containers and VMs simply solves isolation in different layers. Think of it like this. VMs visualize the machine, containers isolate the application. So here is the easiest way to remember this. A virtual machine is like saying, give my application an entire computer. A Docker container is saying, give my application an isolated environment. But now comes the interesting part. If containers don't have their own operating system, how does Docker actually create and isolate them? What happens when you type docker run nginx? Where does the image come from? How does Docker create the containers? How does networking work? How does storage work? And what exactly is the Docker engine doing behind the scene? That's why we are breaking down the Docker architecture in my next video. Please subscribe to Ops by Yash and stay tuned for the latest updates.